I keep a bottle of generic hand soap on the bathroom sink. Nothing fancy, just the cheapest refillable kind I can find. I'd gone in to wash up after cooking, the smell of garlic and onions still clinging to my fingers, and was halfway through rinsing the suds away when something caught my eye. It wasn't anything loud or sudden. No jump, no flicker, no unnatural sound from somewhere in the apartment. Just a detail that hadn't been there before. In the mirror above the sink, my left hand was different. There, wrapped neatly around my ring finger, was a thin red thread. It was tied in a single loop, snug enough that the knot pressed slightly into the skin. The thread was vibrant, red like fresh dye, not something faded or frayed from use. In the dim bathroom lighting, it almost seemed to have its own saturation, standing out from the muted colors around it. I turned my hand over, staring down at it directly. My real, actual hand was bare. The skin was pale from the warm water, unmarked. No thread, no knot. I looked back at the mirror. There it was again. It wasn't like seeing a trick reflection where the angle plays with your head. The knot was in exactly the same place on the same finger, and when I moved my hand, the thread moved too, like it was there, only in the reflection. I dried my hands slowly, glancing from the mirror to my hand and back again. The image didn't flicker or vanish. I even leaned in close, thinking maybe I was catching a distorted glint of the pinkish bathroom tile in the wrong way, but it was definitely a piece of string. I tried flexing my fingers in different positions, watching the reflection follow them precisely. No break in the illusion. I even pressed the pad of my thumb against the spot in real life where the knot would be. I felt only the faint ridges of my skin. I don't know why it unsettled me so much right away. There are plenty of things that can happen to your eyes when you're tired. Phantom colors, floaters, weird after images from looking at screens too long. But this wasn't a blur. It was crisp. Too crisp. I tested another mirror. The hallway one gave me the same result. Red thread around my finger in the reflection. Nothing on my hand when I looked directly. The thread never moved out of place, even when I shifted to different lighting. By the time I'd tried the mirror on the back of my bedroom door, I was starting to feel the air tighten in my chest. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but it was like realizing there's an insect crawling on you, except every time you try to brush it away, there's nothing there. I finally stood in the kitchen staring at the window over the sink. The outside world was dark, just a faint yellow wash from the streetlight. My reflection stared back, faint in the glass, and the thread was there too, barely visible but still undeniably red. I went to bed trying not to think about it. The next day was unremarkable. Work was slow, groceries were expensive, and I spent most of the evening reading on the couch. I'd almost convinced myself the thread thing was just fatigue or some optical fluke, until I went to the bathroom that night. It was there again, same place, same neat knot, only this time I could swear it looked a fraction tighter. The difference was subtle. Maybe the loop sat slightly closer to the skin. Maybe the skin in the reflection was a little paler above it, but it was enough for my stomach to give that faint, instinctive drop. I checked my actual finger again, turning it under the harsh overhead light, still bare, still fine. But I couldn't shake the idea that the reflection skin looked constricted in a way that mine didn't. I forced myself to brush my teeth, rinse my face, and leave. I didn't look in the mirror again that night. The following evening, I caught myself hesitating outside the bathroom door. My reflection had never unnerved me before. I've lived alone for years and mirrors were just part of the background, but the idea of catching that red thread again was enough to stall me. When I finally went in, it was almost a relief to see that the thread was unchanged from the night before. Still there, still too bright, but no more threatening than it had been. That relief didn't last. On the third night, I caught myself leaning in closer, the same way you check a cut or bruise to see if it's healing. The knot in the mirror was definitely tighter now, enough that the skin beneath it had a slight indent. The color of the thread looked richer, like a fresh twist had been added to it. I didn't feel anything on my real finger. No pressure, no numbness, nothing. But my brain kept telling me there should be. I kept rubbing at it anyway, as if I could scrub away a mark that wasn't there. That was when I started avoiding the bathroom light. I'd brush my teeth in the hallway, splash water on my face in the kitchen sink. It was easier than dealing with that strange, mocking little loop in the glass. But reflections aren't just in mirrors. The first time I saw it outside the bathroom was on the glass panel of the oven door. I'd been pulling out a baking sheet, and my head turned just enough to catch my own image, faint and warped by the smudged surface. Even through the distortion, the red stood out. I dropped the sheet with a metallic clang, burning the edge of my hand on the hot tray. By the time I got over the sting, the only thing I could think to do was grab a dish towel and cover the oven handle so I wouldn't accidentally look again. 2 nights later, I caught it in the black screen of my TV. The set was off, but the dim city lights spilling through the blinds gave the screen just enough shine to throw my image back at me. The red thread looked brighter than anything else in the room. I started catching myself checking windows before I walked past them. I avoided polished surfaces. I left the TV unplugged, but no matter how careful I was, the thread would appear somewhere. Always neat, always tied, always around the same finger. By the end of that week, I'd stopped wondering whether it was real. The question wasn't whether it existed. It was why it was only visible in reflections and why it was changing. On the 8th day, I saw it in the bathroom again, tighter than ever. The loop sat deep enough into the skin in the reflection that it looked uncomfortable. My real finger still looked fine, but I kept flexing it, half expecting the blood flow to feel sluggish. It was the first time I noticed the faintest sensation there, a phantom awareness of something around the joint. Not pain, not even proper pressure. More like the ghost of a rubber band that's been worn all day and just taken off, leaving a memory behind. That was when I started to feel uneasy in my own skin. The mirror never changed anything else. My face was my face. My hair was the same messy brown, my eyes the same dull green. But that red thread seemed like an alien element stitched into my image without my consent. It wasn't until the end of the 2nd week that something else shifted. I was doing dishes late, the kitchen light off, the only glow coming from the street outside. I bent to stack a plate on the rack and caught my reflection in the window above the sink, thread around my finger as usual. But in that moment, I could have sworn the thread twitched. It wasn't my hand that moved. It wasn't the normal shift of muscle and skin when you grip something. The thread itself seemed to tighten in a pulse, like someone on the other end had given it the faintest tug. I froze. My hands stayed in the soapy water, but my eyes were locked on the glass. The thread lay still again almost immediately, as if nothing had happened. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, but when I looked down at my actual hand, I found myself clenching it reflexively, guarding it. That night, I didn't go near a mirror at all. I told myself that if I just ignored it, it would stop. That made sense in my head. If this was some strange trick of my eyes or my brain, maybe it would fade like any other afterimage or hallucination. I wouldn't feed it attention, wouldn't let it occupy my mind. That lasted less than 2 days. The 2nd morning, I woke up with my left hand curled tight under my pillow. I must have been gripping it in my sleep because my knuckles ached. The strange part wasn't the soreness, it was the certainty, before I even opened my eyes, that the thread was tighter now. I went straight to the bathroom mirror without turning on the light. The dawn light from the window was enough to see the reflection. It had changed. The knot was still neat, still perfectly tied, but the loop had narrowed. In the reflection, my skin was faintly dented beneath it, a ring-shaped impression pressing in, as if from hours of constant pressure. I glanced at my real hand. The skin looked fine, no indentation, no swelling, but I could feel it now. Not pain, just an awareness, like the phantom sensation had deepened into something more tangible, as if I'd wrapped a piece of thread loosely around my finger and worn it for hours. I pulled my gaze away. The more I looked, the more I felt that faint throb under the skin. The thread didn't only exist in mirrors anymore, it was working its way into me. Over the next few days, I found it harder to avoid. I'd pass a darkened shop window on the way home and catch the red loop before I even registered my own face. A reflection in the stainless steel panel of the elevator would flash that knot at me, the rest of my image hazy but that single thread sharp and in focus. Every time, it seemed a fraction tighter. By the fourth day, I could swear the skin in the reflection was starting to pale beyond the knot, like circulation was being cut off. My actual hands still looked fine, but I couldn't shake the urge to flex my fingers constantly, testing that they still worked. That was when I started noticing something worse. The reflection wasn't always in sync with me anymore, not in a big horror movie way, no delayed movements or independent actions, just moments where the hand seemed to hang an instant too long in one position after I'd already moved it. A delay of a heartbeat, maybe less, but enough to make the hair on my arms lift. I started wearing gloves around the apartment. Ridiculous, I know. Thin cotton ones I'd bought years ago to moisturize my hands overnight. I thought maybe if I couldn't see the finger, I could forget about it. That plan lasted until I realized reflections didn't care about the gloves. The thread appeared above them in the glass, tied directly against my skin as if the fabric wasn't there. By the end of the week, I was feeling it constantly. Not pain, at least not yet, but an insistent tug every now and then, like a fishing line being tested for slack. It happened in the grocery store, of all places. I was looking at a pyramid of apples, my mind completely elsewhere, when a pulse of pressure shot through that finger hard enough to make me gasp. I jerked my hand back like I'd been shocked. The older woman next to me gave me a strange look. I muttered something about a cramp and left without buying anything. That night, I caught it in the kitchen window again. The thread in the reflection was tighter than ever. The knot sunk deep enough into the skin that it looked like a thin cut. For the first time, I thought I saw a faint glisten there, like a bead of blood was about to form. I touched my real finger and felt nothing but smooth, unbroken skin. I kept telling myself that was the line. If it started cutting into the actual flesh, I'd see a doctor. I'd force myself to explain this impossible thing and deal with the disbelief. But until then, I could manage. I didn't really believe that. The following day, I made the mistake of looking at myself in the bathroom after work. My hair was a mess from the wind, my eyes dull from staring at spreadsheets all day, but my gaze went straight to the finger. The loop was tighter still. It looked as if the thread was pulling from somewhere out of sight, its end disappearing beyond the edge of the mirror's frame. I raised my hand in the reflection and slowly turned my body until I was facing sideways. The end of the thread vanished into empty space. No source, no spool, nothing visible. Just a pull into nothing. I left the bathroom without turning off the light. I didn't go back in for the rest of the night, but the next morning, I didn't need to. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee, when I glanced down at the side of the mug and saw my reflection in the curved ceramic surface. Distorted and pale, yes, but still there. And so was the thread. The knot was pulled so tight in the reflection now that the skin around it was beginning to bruise. A faint halo of darker color circled the finger, contrasting against the thread's bright red. I lifted my real hand into the light, still fine, still unmarked, but I could feel the circulation change now, a mild, almost pleasant warmth that didn't match the rest of my hand. It scared me more than pain would have. I started avoiding reflective surfaces entirely. I kept the TV covered, the oven door taped with brown paper. I stopped using my phone's front camera. I even took the bathroom mirror down, leaning it face first against the wall. But reflections aren't something you can banish completely. They live in puddles, in neighbors' windows, in car doors parked along the street. and the thread was in all of them. The tightness in my finger began to feel like a permanent state, something I'd had my whole life but had only just noticed. Sometimes when I was lying in bed, I'd flex my fingers and feel that one respond a split second later, as if waiting for permission. I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if it kept getting tighter. One night, as I was crossing the living room to close the blinds, I saw it again in the dark window. My reflection's finger was bone white beyond the knot, the threads red almost glowing against the dim backdrop, and, though I didn't want to admit it, I thought I saw the smallest flicker of movement. The thread pulling, taut for an instant, then slackening, like someone testing the strength of the connection. I stepped back from the glass so hard I tripped on the coffee table and nearly went over it. My hand throbbed faintly, though whether from impact or from that invisible tug I couldn't say. From that point on, it didn't matter if I wanted to look or not. The image was burned into my mind. Even without a mirror, I could picture it perfectly. The knot, the dented skin, the pull towards somewhere I couldn't see. I caught myself one afternoon staring at my own shadow on the sidewalk, scanning for that thread as if it could cross over into the silhouette. It didn't, but the relief was short-lived. That night, while rinsing vegetables in the sink, I saw my reflection in the stainless steel faucet, and this time, the knot wasn't perfectly neat anymore. It had shifted, the loops uneven, as if it had been tightened in a hurry, and it was undeniably deeper into the skin than before, so deep it looked like it would be painful to move the finger at all. The phantom sensation grew stronger that evening, a constant awareness that bordered on a throb. I fell asleep with my left hand resting on my chest, trying to convince myself it was still mine to move. By morning, I knew it was only going to get worse. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, the phantom tightness in my finger making me restless. At some point, I must have blinked, and that was when everything changed. The pressure in my fingers sharpened, more insistent than it had ever been, and then there was warmth on the back of my neck, the weight of sunlight that didn't belong in my apartment. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers, sweet, thick, almost cloying. Around me, a murmur of voices and the faint creak of wood underfoot. When I opened my eyes, I was standing. I could feel warmth on my skin, the unmistakable weight of sunlight on the back of my neck. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers, sweet, thick, almost cloying. Around me, a murmur of voices and the faint creak of wood underfoot. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else entirely. A courtyard stretched out ahead, paved with smooth stone, ringed by low walls draped in garlands of red and white blooms. A line of paper lanterns swayed gently overhead, though there was no wind. I wasn't wearing my own clothes. A pale fabric, white maybe cream, flowed around my arms, the loose sleeves heavy with embroidery. The weight of it made my hands hang oddly still at my sides, and on my left hand, a red thread wound tight around my ring finger, not thin this time, but thick, like the first loop of something more substantial. It tugged faintly, leading forward. At the other end of the thread, just out of focus, was a figure. I tried to make out their face, but the air seemed to warp around it, blurring the details. The only thing I could see clearly was the posture, straight-backed, waiting. The moment I took a step toward them, everything went black. I was back in my bed, heart pounding, the darkness of the room pressing in. My left hand was curled tight against my chest, and though it was bare, the phantom tug lingered. I told myself I'd fallen asleep without realizing it, that it was just a dream. But the next night, it happened again. This time I was sure I was awake. I'd been lying there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the kitchen clock through the thin walls. My eyes closed for only a second, and then the warmth and the scent of flowers came rushing in again. The courtyard was exactly the same, stone paving, garlands, lanterns, but I was standing closer to the figure. The thread between us was shorter now, though still loose. When I turned to look around, I noticed something new, a low wooden table against the wall to my right, covered in neatly folded white cloth. On top sat a shallow bronze bowl, its surface rippling as if disturbed by a drop of water. I didn't remember walking closer, but suddenly I was near enough to see my own reflection in the bowl's surface. The thread on my finger was bright, almost wet-looking, as if freshly dyed. The figure at the other end of the thread shifted. The movement was small, just a tilt of the head, but it was enough to send a pulse down the cord. The pressure in my finger grew sharper for an instant, like a quick squeeze. Then I was back in my bed again. By the third time, I stopped pretending it was a dream. It was always the same courtyard, always the same figure at the other end of the thread, and every time, the distance between us closed slightly. The sensations followed me back, warmth on my skin, the echo of floral perfume, the memory of the thread's pull. During the day, I found myself looking for courtyards. I'd take detours through unfamiliar streets, glancing between buildings, scanning for lanterns or garlands. Nothing came close. The place in my visions didn't seem to belong to any part of the city I knew, and yet the more I thought about it, the more it felt like somewhere I'd been before. By the end of that week, the thread in the mirror was as tight as I'd ever seen it. The skin beyond the knot was white in the reflection, the redness of the thread almost painful to look at. The sensation in my real finger had shifted from a ghostly pressure to something more present, like wearing a ring that doesn't quite fit. I started wondering if the thread in the vision and the one in the mirror were the same. It wasn't just the courtyard anymore. I began to catch flashes of the white cloth in places it shouldn't be, in the blur of a passing bus window, in the reflection of a puddle, always just for an instant, and always gone before I could turn my head. I tried to stay up late, thinking if I could avoid sleep entirely, I could keep the courtyard away. But exhaustion has its own pull, and it's harder to fight than fear. One night, after hours of tossing in bed, I gave in and let my eyes close. When they opened again, the courtyard was brighter than before. The lanterns swayed as though in a soft breeze, though my hair didn't move. The air was warm but carried a strange weight, as if the sun was pressing directly down on me. The figure was closer still. I could see the outline of their clothing now, formal, layered, the fabric dark and rich against the pale stone. They didn't move toward me, but the thread between us was taut, humming faintly in a way that I could feel in my chest. I looked down at my hand in the vision and saw that the knot was no longer neat. It had been pulled tight enough that the ends were frayed, fibers sticking out like whiskers. I woke with my left hand aching, though there was no mark. The more it happened, the harder it became to separate the two worlds. I'd be walking home from work and catch a whiff of that thick floral scent, even in the middle of traffic. I'd feel sunlight on my skin in the shade of an alley. And once, just once, I thought I heard the faint sound of wood creaking behind me, the same way it did underfoot in the courtyard. When I spun around, I was alone. I told myself I'd start writing down the details after each vision, in case there was a pattern. But the truth was, I didn't need to. Every detail stuck in my mind without effort. The texture of the paving stones, the angle of the lanterns, the sound of fabric shifting when the figure moved. What unsettled me most was how natural it felt to be there, like the courtyard was a place I belonged. I don't know when I started expecting it each night. The pull of the courtyard didn't fade when the sun came up. I'd be at my desk at work, trying to answer emails, and my mind would drift back to it. The garlands, the lanterns, the way the sunlight felt too heavy. Even when I forced myself to focus, the memory pressed in around the edges. I started looking for an explanation. It began with lazy, unfocused searches, red string folklore, string tied around finger and reflection, red thread myth. The results were scattered and vague. Most of what came up was the red thread of fate, a romantic idea that two people destined to meet are connected by an invisible cord tied around their pinkies. That didn't fit. The thread around my finger was visible, at least in reflections, and it wasn't tied to my pinky. And none of the stories I read mentioned the thread tightening, or leaving marks, or dragging someone somewhere they didn't want to be. Digging deeper meant reading articles from obscure blogs and old forum posts. The further I went, the stranger the connections became. There were mentions of the thread being used in rituals, not for romance, but for binding. Some described tying a living person to the dead. In a few cultures, it was supposedly part of a ghost marriage, an arranged union between a deceased person and someone still alive. I stopped on a grainy scanned page from what looked like a very old book. The passage was short but unsettling. It described a practice where the living bride or groom might not be willing, so the spirit's family or the spirit itself would seek and claim them, binding them with a cord. The cord would tighten each day until the living could no longer resist. I read it twice, the words sticking in my mind like burrs. I couldn't tell if I believed any of it, but the part about the tightening was too close to what I'd been experiencing. The image from the book stuck with me all evening. I found myself at the kitchen table with my laptop, searching for any sign that this kind of ritual could happen without consent, without knowledge. Most results were useless. Summaries of legends, tourist articles, short horror stories pretending to be factual accounts. But here and there, I caught fragments that made my stomach twist. A mention of red string being placed on the ring finger to symbolize marriage to the spirit world. A claim that once the bond was visible, it couldn't be undone without destroying the object that anchored it. The problem was, I didn't have an object. At least, not that I knew of. For a while I tried to tell myself that was the important detail, that this couldn't be happening without some kind of talisman, something physical to burn or bury. It was a comforting thought until I remembered that I'd been seeing the courtyard and the figure, and each time the thread was thicker, the knot tighter. That night when I closed my eyes, I felt the thread pulling before I saw anything. The courtyard appeared in full daylight, the flowers so bright they almost hurt to look at. The figure at the other end of the thread was close enough now that I could hear the faint shift of their clothing. I didn't want to step closer, but the pull was constant, subtle, a reminder that I was already moving toward them whether I liked it or not. When I woke, my left hand was sore. It didn't look any different, but the sensation of having something tied there lingered long after I sat up in bed. I spent the next morning reading about cutting the red thread. Some articles suggested it was possible if you could find the source. Others warned that cutting it without permission from the one who tied it would lead to illness or death. I didn't know how much was superstition and how much was meant to frighten people into compliance. It was the mention of finding the source that stuck with me. I thought about the courtyard, the folded white cloth, the bronze bowl. They were always there, always the same. If they were symbols, I didn't know what they represented, but they felt fixed, important. I started wondering if they existed somewhere in the real world. It was stupid maybe, but I began walking the neighborhood after work, scanning for anything, an arch, a wall, a tree, that felt remotely familiar. The city is a patchwork of old and new, and sometimes you stumble onto little pockets that seem untouched for decades. I thought maybe I'd find an old house with a courtyard, or some neglected garden hidden behind rusted gates. Most of what I found was ordinary, but on the third evening, I noticed a gap in the row of apartment buildings along 7th Street. A chain-link fence had been put up across a narrow lot, and behind it was a mess of broken brick, splintered wood, and toppled stone. The ground was uneven, mounded in places where weeds had already taken root. It didn't look like the courtyard, but something about the space made my chest tighten. I stood there for a long time, my fingers curled against the cold metal of the fence. A faded sign, half collapsed, warned of demolition in progress. Whatever had been there was gone now, reduced to piles of debris. I turned to leave, but in the corner of my eye, something bright caught the light. It was gone when I looked directly, but I knew what I'd seen, a flash of red. When I got home that night, I didn't even need a mirror. I could feel it without looking. The thread in the reflection would be tighter now. I forced myself to check. In the bathroom mirror, the knot was almost biting into the skin in the reflection, the line around it darker than ever. I couldn't feel pain in my real hand yet, but the phantom pull was so constant I thought I might scream just to break the sensation. That was when I stopped thinking of it as odd or unexplained. It wasn't just a strange thing happening to me, it was leading somewhere, and I was running out of time. I told myself I wouldn't go back to the lot on 7th Street, but 2 nights later I found myself there again, standing in the same place, fingers curled around the same patch of fence. The air smelled faintly of rain and rust, and even in the dark, the mounds of rubble looked the same as before. It didn't matter that I couldn't see it. The pull in my finger was stronger here. I could almost imagine that if I reached through the fence, the thread in the reflection would go taut. I stayed too long, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I walked home with my shoulders tight, checking behind me every block. The moment I opened the apartment door, I knew something had changed. It was subtle, but I've lived here long enough to know the exact feel of the place. The arrangement of the air, the smell, the way sound carries. This felt wrong. I went straight to the kitchen and froze. The chair I always keep tucked under the table was pulled halfway out. My keys, which I'd left in a bowl by the door that morning, were now resting on the counter next to the sink. It wasn't much. Nothing broken, nothing missing, but I don't move my keys once they're in that bowl, and I never leave the chair out. I checked every room. No one was here. The locks were intact. That night, the thread in the mirror was tighter again. In the reflection, the skin beyond the knot looked faintly swollen now, the color dim and unhealthy. My real hand still looked fine, but the phantom sensation was constant, an unyielding grip that didn't loosen even when I lay perfectly still. The next morning, the living room window was open a few inches. I keep it locked, always. The latch was still in place, but when I tried to close it, the frame shuddered, as if something heavy had pressed against it from the outside. The days blurred. I'd wake to find a cabinet door open, a picture frame tilted, a glass on the counter that I hadn't taken out. Small, quiet shifts, just enough to tell me that something was sharing my space. The courtyard was changing too. The last time I found myself there, the flowers in the garlands were fresher, brighter, their scent stronger. The figure at the other end of the thread was close enough that I could see their sleeves, dark fabric lined with red, swaying faintly though the air was still. I couldn't make myself speak. My throat wouldn't allow it. Instead, I turned to the bronze bowl on the table. This time, the ripples on its surface were wider, overlapping, as if something had been dropped into it just before I looked. My reflection in the water was distorted, but the thread on my finger was perfectly sharp. The knot was frayed almost to breaking. When I woke, there was an ache in my left hand deep enough to make me flex it over and over. The skin still looked normal, but I knew it was lying to me. By then, I'd stopped avoiding the mirror. I checked it every morning, every night, as if keeping track would help. The knot was cutting deeper in the reflection, the groove in the skin now dark, like the first hint of a wound. The intrusion at home escalated. I'd hear faint movements in the kitchen when I was in bed, the sound of something sliding across the counter, the whisper of a cabinet door closing. Once I heard the creak of the floor right outside my bedroom. I never saw anyone. One evening, after work, I stepped into the apartment and froze. My bedroom door was open. I always close it before I leave. Inside, everything looked untouched, except for the bedspread. It had been turned down as if waiting for me. That night in the courtyard, the figure was close enough that the thread between us hung in a straight line. Their head tilted slightly, the movement so subtle it could have been my imagination. The air was heavier, the light dimmer, like the sun was beginning to set. I took a step back, but the thread didn't slacken. When I woke, my real hand had gone numb in the night. The sensation faded after a few minutes, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. I tried to tell myself it was just the way I'd slept, but I knew better. The following morning, I found something on the kitchen table. A single flower petal. Red, soft, fresh. It was exactly the color of the garlands in the courtyard. I didn't touch it. I swept it into a paper towel and threw it in the trash, then took the trash outside to the dumpster. When I came back, there was another petal on the table. I don't remember locking the door that night, but I do remember the weight in the air as I lay in bed. My heart was pounding before my eyes even closed, as if my body already knew where I was going. The courtyard was quiet. The figure at the other end of the thread stood perfectly still. The knot on my finger in that place looked one pull away from cutting into the bone. I didn't move. I didn't breathe, but the thread still seemed to draw me forward, the distance shrinking whether I willed it or not. When I woke, there was no numbness, no pain, but my left hand felt claimed, not in a figurative way. It felt like something else had decided it belonged to them now, and I was just holding on to it until they came to take it. I couldn't stop thinking about the petal. Even after I'd thrown it out, even after I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the second one, I kept seeing that deep red every time I closed my eyes. It was the same shade as the thread, the same shade as the thin, frayed fibers in the knot. By the third morning, I was done pretending I could just wait this out. I didn't know if I could break the connection, but I needed to see where it was leading. The courtyard wasn't anywhere in my neighborhood, that much I was sure of. But maybe there were pieces of it scattered here, fragments of the place bleeding into the real world. The bronze bowl, the folded cloth, the lanterns, the flowers. If the petal had found its way into my kitchen, maybe I could trace it back. I started walking different routes home from work. Some nights I'd circle for hours, scanning alleys and vacant lots, peering into gated gardens and churchyards. I learned the cracks in the sidewalks, the sagging fences, the faint outlines of buildings long gone. I didn't find the courtyard, but I started to find places that felt close to it. There was a narrow alley 3 streets over, wedged between 2 abandoned warehouses where the air always smelled faintly of incense. A cluster of overgrown planters in front of a shuttered laundromat, their soil scattered with withered petals the wind never seemed to carry away. A side street where the street lights were all out, but someone had strung paper lanterns in the windows above. None of them were right, but each time I passed one, the tug in my finger grew just a little stronger. One Saturday morning, I set out early and kept walking until my legs ached. I crossed under the freeway, wandered through streets where the pavement turned to packed dirt, past storefronts with signs in languages I couldn't read. I was about to turn back when I saw the fence. It was taller than the chain link around the lot on 7th Street, with sheets of corrugated metal bolted to the inside to block the view. A strip of yellow caution tape hung limp across the padlocked gate. Through a gap where 2 panels didn't quite meet, I could see piles of stone and splintered wood. It was nothing special at first glance, just another demolition site. But the air changed when I stepped closer. It wasn't colder or warmer, but heavier, like the atmosphere before a storm. The tug in my finger sharpened, deep enough that I flinched. I peered through the gap. What I saw wasn't a courtyard, not anymore. It had been something once. There were outlines in the rubble that suggested walls, the base of an arch, maybe the remains of a platform, but whatever it had been was gone now. The ground was uneven, torn up in places where the earth looked fresher than the rest, and there, half buried under a slab of broken tile, was wood. I couldn't see much of it, just a corner, but the surface was carved. The marks were worn, smoothed by time and weather, but I recognized the shape, the edge of a plaque. I don't remember deciding to move. One second I was at the gate, the next I was walking along the fence, scanning for a place to get through. I found it at the far corner, a gap where the metal sheets had been pulled back just far enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, the air felt thicker. Every step made the tug in my finger ache. I picked my way across the rubble, toward the plaque. It was larger than I thought, nearly 2 feet across, the wood dark with age. Most of the carvings were too faint to make out, but near the bottom, under a smear of dirt, I saw letters. I wiped the surface with my sleeve, my breath fogging in the still air. The carving was shallow but clear enough to read. It was my name, not just the first name, my full name, middle included, the way it appears on official forms. The date beneath it wasn't one I recognized, but it was in the future. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. My pulse was so loud I barely heard the faint creak of wood behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there, just piles of debris, the fence, the gap I'd come through. When I looked back at the plaque, the tug in my finger surged. For a second, I thought the thread in the reflection might actually be there, visible in the air, but the feeling faded before I could focus on it. I left the plaque where it was. I didn't want to touch it. By the time I got home, my left hand was throbbing. Not phantom pain anymore, real pain, low and constant, as if the thread was digging into flesh I couldn't see. I went to the bathroom and turned on the light. The reflection didn't lie. The knot was sunk deep into the skin now, so deep that the skin on either side bulged slightly. The red was almost luminous against the pallor. I pressed my real hand flat on the counter. The skin was still unbroken, but I could feel the pressure there in a way I never had before. That night in the courtyard, the sun was lower, the light softer, and the figure was close enough that I could hear them breathe. The thread between us was a straight, tense line. The bronze bowl was gone. In its place, on the table, lay the plaque, clean, whole, my name carved fresh into the wood, the date beneath it gleaming as though it had just been cut. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I half expected to be standing in the courtyard again, the plaque waiting for me like an accusation. But the night passed without visions, which was almost worse. It felt like being watched from somewhere just out of sight. By morning, my left hand ached. It was a steady, deep discomfort, like the bone itself was being pressed. I kept rubbing the finger through the fabric of my sleeve, as if that could hide it from whatever had tied the knot. I couldn't stay in the apartment. The walls felt close, the air stale, and every sound seemed to echo in ways it shouldn't. I walked without any real plan, letting the streets pull me where they wanted. It wasn't until I saw the bent corner of the fence again that I realized where I'd ended up. The lot looked the same as before, piles of rubble, weeds curling through cracks, but the air shifted as soon as I stepped closer. My pulse quickened. I knew I was going to go in before I even spotted the gap in the metal panels. The ground inside crunched underfoot. I moved carefully over broken tile and splintered beams, the smell of damp earth and dust clogging my nose. The plaque was still there. It lay exactly where I'd seen it last, half buried under a slab of tile. The wood was darker now, the grain slick with a faint sheen as if it had been caught in a mist. My name was still visible through the dirt, the lines of the carving unnervingly precise. I crouched, brushing the rest of the dirt away with my fingers. The letters were perfect, too perfect for something that should have been weathered by years, and the date beneath them. It was closer now. I pulled my hand back so fast I nearly fell. Somewhere to my left, wood creaked again. I turned, scanning the empty lot, the sagging fence, the skeletal remains of whatever structure had been here. No movement, no figure. But the sound had been close, too close to mistake for the groan of the fence in the wind. I looked back down at the plaque. The tug in my finger was sharp now, almost urgent. For a moment I thought the knot in the reflection might break through to my actual skin. I could feel my heartbeat in that one point, pulsing in time with the pull. I didn't touch the plaque again. I stood and backed away until my heels hit the fence. On the walk home I noticed something strange. The shadows of the streetlights seemed to stretch farther than they should, bending faintly toward my left side. It might have been my imagination, but it made me keep my hands in my pockets the rest of the way. That night, I didn't fight the pull to the courtyard. The air there was different now, cooler but heavier, like a storm was building. The garlands of flowers looked newly hung, the petals almost waxy with freshness. And on the table, the plaque was there again, not buried, not damaged, whole and upright, the wood polished to a shine. My name was etched deep into its surface, the grooves clean and sharp, as if carved minutes ago. The figure stood behind it, closer than they had ever been. I could make out the curve of their shoulders, the fold of the fabric at their sleeves, the faint outline of hands resting at their sides. I tried to speak, but the air seemed too thick to carry my voice. The figure tilted their head just slightly, as though listening anyway. The pull in the thread grew until I thought it might tear my finger from my hand. I woke with my left hand curled into a fist so tight my nails had left marks in my palm. The skin was still unbroken, but the finger felt like it had been trapped in a clamp all night. I didn't need to look in the mirror to know it was tighter again. The next day, I tried to stay away from the lot. I walked in the opposite direction after work, took side streets that looped me far from it, but even without going near, the tug in my finger didn't ease. It was as if finding the plaque had closed some distance that couldn't be reopened. 2 days later, I found myself there again without remembering the walk. One moment I was wandering through back streets, the next I was standing at the bent corner of the fence, my hand already on the cold metal. Inside, the lot seemed quieter than before, like the air itself had stopped moving. The rubble felt more deliberate now, the piles arranged in a way that suggested pathways rather than random collapse. I followed them without thinking, my eyes on the place where the plaque had been. It wasn't there. Instead, at the center of the lot, I found a shallow pit. The earth at the bottom was damp, the edges lined with broken stones that looked like the remnants of a foundation, and in the center of that pit was a length of red thread. It was thicker than the one in the mirror, coiled loosely as though waiting to be picked up. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. When I turned to leave, I saw something in my peripheral vision, a shape, tall and still, watching from just beyond the edge of the lot. I didn't look directly. The moment I shifted my gaze, it was gone. I made it home without remembering the route. That night, the courtyard was different. The sun had nearly set, the lanterns above glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure stood closer than ever, close enough that the folds of their clothing were sharp and clear. The thread between us was straight, drawn so tight it might have been a wire. On the table, the plaque gleamed in the lantern light. The date carved beneath my name was tomorrow's. The date on the plaque stayed in my head all night. I couldn't stop replaying the way the lantern light had caught in the grooves of the carving, the way the numbers seemed to glint like fresh paint. Tomorrow. Not a vague future, not months away. Tomorrow. When I woke, my left hand was aching so badly I had to cradle it against my chest just to get out of bed. The phantom pull wasn't just in the finger anymore. It spread up into my palm, up the forearm, like an invisible line had been stitched under the skin. I didn't want to see the mirror. I knew what I'd find, but I couldn't stop myself. The reflection showed what my body refused to. The red thread was no longer a single loop around my ring finger. It had coiled upward, winding around my hand and halfway up my wrist. The knot at my finger was buried deep now, the skin above it pale and tight. I turned my arm in the light, searching for any sign it was really there. My own skin looked untouched, but I could feel the constriction every time I moved my hand, a dull resistance in the tendons. It wasn't just the thread that had changed. The reflection's background didn't quite match the room anymore. The edges of the mirror's image felt wrong, like they were too dark, too narrow. I stepped back, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faint suggestion of flowers behind my reflected self, out of focus, but there. The air in the apartment carried that same floral scent all day. No matter where I went, the kitchen, the living room, even the shower, it followed me, seeping into my clothes, my hair. That night, I didn't fight the visions. There was no point. The courtyard was bathed in orange light, the sun low on the horizon. The garlands had doubled, hung thick along the walls, their petals fresh and almost waxy. The paper lanterns overhead were glowing faintly, as though lit from within even before darkness had settled. The figure was close enough now that I could see the silhouette of their jaw beneath the blur, the line of their neck, the shape of their hands folded at the waist. The thread between us was a single unbroken line, running from my finger straight to theirs. When I looked down, I saw that here, too, the thread wound up my wrist exactly as it did in the mirror. But in this place, I could feel it biting into my skin with every small movement. The table that had once held the bronze bowl and then the plaque now held something else entirely, a neatly folded length of white cloth, perfectly centered, edges aligned with the table's corners. Beside it was a small, shallow dish filled with a dark liquid. I didn't move toward it. The pull in the thread didn't seem to need me to. The figure stepped forward. Not much, just enough to close a fraction of the distance between us, but I felt it in the thread immediately. The sudden tightening, the jolt through my chest. The air thickened with the scent of the flowers until it was all I could taste. My throat ached like I'd swallowed something too dry. I woke with my hand halfway off the bed, arm extended toward the floor. The phantom thread tugged faintly as I pulled it back. The next morning, I found my front door unlocked. I hadn't touched it since coming home the night before. There was something lying just inside on the mat. A strip of white fabric, folded once. It wasn't old or dirty, just plain and clean, the kind of material you'd expect for a sash or ceremonial wrap. I didn't touch it. I stepped over it, heart pounding, and went straight to the kitchen. When I glanced back, the fabric was gone. By the end of the day, the pull in my arm was constant. I'd stopped thinking of it as phantom anymore. It was too solid, too heavy. I kept expecting to look down and see it there in the flesh. That night, the courtyard was darker, the sun fully set, the lanterns above glowing in a steady pattern. The figure stood only a few steps away now. I could see the embroidery at the edges of their sleeves, red stitched over black curling patterns I didn't recognize. The thread up my wrist felt like a shackle. Every time I breathed, I could feel it move slightly against my skin. The table was closer this time, though I hadn't moved. The white cloth was gone, and in its place was the plaque. The date was no longer tomorrow. It was today. The figure's hands moved, fingers curling slightly, and the thread pulled hard enough to make me stumble forward. I woke with my feet pressed against the edge of the mattress as though I'd been standing when sleep broke. My left arm was still extended toward the floor, wrist tingling with pins and needles. The clock read 3:02 a.m. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the couch, the apartment dark except for the streetlight through the blinds, cradling my arm and waiting for the sun to come up. By morning, the sensation in my wrist had changed again. It wasn't just tight. It was warm, the kind of deep warmth that feels like blood rushing under the skin after being cut off too long. I knew what that meant. The connection was almost complete. The morning passed in a blur. I kept pacing from room to room, checking the locks, the windows, the corners where shadows pooled. It didn't matter. None of it made the pulling in my arm stop. By noon, I was standing by the door with my shoes on, keys in my hand. I didn't have a plan, just a direction. I had to go back to the lot. If the plaque was still there, maybe I could burn it, break it, bury it somewhere far enough away that it couldn't reach me. The streets felt off as I walked, quieter than usual, as if the city had been stripped of its background noise. Even the passing cars seemed muted, their engines low and dull. The only thing I could hear clearly was the faint pulse in my arm, timed perfectly with my steps. When the bent corner of the fence came into view, I didn't hesitate. I slipped through the gap in the metal sheets and crossed the rubble-strewn lot, my eyes scanning for the plaque. It wasn't buried this time. It was lying in plain sight at the center of the space, propped against a jagged piece of stone as if it had been waiting for me. Up close, the wood gleamed. The letters of my name were so sharp they looked freshly cut, and the date beneath was no longer carved. It was painted in a deep, wet red that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. My mouth went dry. I pulled the lighter from my pocket, cheap, disposable, the kind you buy at a corner store without thinking. My hands shook as I flicked it to life, the flame flickering unsteadily in the still air. I held it to the plaque. Nothing happened. The wood didn't darken, didn't smoke. The flame bent slightly away from it, as if the heat couldn't touch it. I pressed the lighter closer until my thumb ached from the pressure, but it was like trying to burn stone. I dropped the lighter and grabbed the plaque with both hands, meaning to smash it against the nearest pile of rubble. The moment my fingers touched the wood, the pull in my arm surged so violently that I nearly fell to my knees. I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, in the base of my skull, a single unbroken line running straight through me, tightening with every breath. I staggered back and let go. The plaque fell flat on the ground with a dull, final sound. When I looked down at my left hand, my breath caught. For the first time, the thread was there, visible, real, coiling up my wrist in the open air. The knot at my finger was so tight the skin above it bulged, and the red glistened as though wet. I ran. By the time I reached my apartment, my arm was aching all the way to the shoulder. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, shaking, my hand throbbing with every heartbeat. I didn't want to look in the mirror. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. In the reflection, I was no longer wearing my own clothes. The white fabric from the courtyard draped over me, heavy with embroidery, the sleeves loose around my arms. The thread around my wrist was thicker now, wound with ceremonial precision, the end disappearing off the edge of the glass as though it were leading away to somewhere just out of sight. The background of the mirror wasn't my apartment anymore. It was the courtyard. I could see the garlands, the lanterns, the low walls. The light in that place was soft, dim, as if it were evening, and in the far edge of the reflection, half in shadow, the figure was waiting. I backed away until my shoulder hit the wall. The image didn't change. My reflection stayed dressed for a ceremony I hadn't agreed to, the thread binding me to someone I couldn't fully see. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep in bed. I sat on the couch, lights off, watching the window as if something might appear there. The floral scent seeped into the room around midnight, strong enough to taste. At some point, my eyes must have closed, because when I opened them, I was standing in the courtyard again. The lanterns above were all lit, swaying gently in the still air. The garlands were fresh, the petals almost glowing in the warm light. The figure stood only a few steps away, hands folded, the thread between us pulled so tight it felt like it could cut me in half if it snapped. On the table, the plaque rested upright. The date on it was today. The figure's head tilted, and the thread gave one final steady pull. I woke with my feet pressed against the floor, my body leaning forward as though I'd been in the middle of a step. My left arm ached so badly I had to hold it with my right hand just to move it. The clock on the wall read 4:47 a.m. I stayed awake until sunrise. The sun rose pale and cold, but it didn't matter. My arm still throbbed like I'd slept with it caught in a vice. I made coffee I didn't drink, paced the apartment until my legs ached, sat, stood, paced again. Every time I passed the bathroom, my gaze drifted to the mirror. I tried to ignore it, but by mid-morning I gave in. I stepped inside and flipped on the light. In the reflection, the transformation was complete. The white garment hung over me in full, the embroidery curling down the sleeves, the hem brushing the tops of my feet. The thread no longer stopped at my wrist. It climbed my forearm in tight, deliberate coils, wrapping over the elbow and pulling the fabric snug against my skin. The knot at my finger was gone. In its place was a seamless line of red, as if the cord had grown out of my flesh. The end of it didn't vanish at the edge of the glass anymore. It stretched outward, away from me, disappearing into the soft lantern glow of the courtyard behind my reflected self. I backed away, but the reflection stayed. The background never shifted, back to my apartment. By early afternoon, I knew the day wasn't going to pass quietly. The floral scent had filled every corner of the apartment, seeping into the cushions, the curtains, my clothes. It was so thick I could taste it with every breath. At 5:42 p.m., the thread began to move. I was in the kitchen when the pull came. Not a sharp tug this time, but a slow, steady draw that made my left arm lift without my permission. I braced my hand against the counter, but the pressure didn't ease. My pulse was in my throat now, in my jaw, in the tips of my fingers. I stumbled toward the couch, thinking if I sat down, I could anchor myself. But the pull only grew stronger, dragging me toward the front door. "No," I said aloud, but my voice felt thin, drowned under the hum in my chest. The doorknob turned under my own hand. I didn't remember reaching for it. The lock clicked open, and the cold air from the hall rushed in. I tried to plant my feet, but my legs moved anyway. Step after step, the hallway stretched long and quiet. The street outside was empty. The sky was dimming toward evening, a muted blue giving way to orange at the horizon. The thread in my arm was hot now, as if it had been left in the sun too long. I didn't look for where it led. I didn't need to. My body was already following it. I walked without choosing the path, turning corners I didn't recognize, passing buildings I'd never seen. At some point, the streets narrowed, the pavement turned to packed dirt, and the air grew still. Then I saw the fence, not the bent corner I'd slipped through before. This was a wider opening, the gate pulled completely aside as though waiting. Inside, the rubble was gone. In its place was the courtyard, whole. The garlands hung fresh and bright along the low walls. The paper lanterns swayed above, each one glowing softly against the darkening sky. The stone paving was smooth and clean, the air thick with the scent of flowers. I crossed the threshold without stopping. The thread eased as I stepped onto the stones, loosening just enough to let me breathe. My feet moved toward the center, toward the table. The plaque was there, upright and perfect, my name etched deep into its polished surface. The date beneath it was today's, the numbers filled with a rich red that caught the lantern light. Behind the table, the figure stood waiting. Up close, their face was still blurred, but I could see everything else. The fine embroidery at the edges of their dark garments, the precise way their hands rested over each other, the way their shoulders didn't move with breath. The thread in my arm gave one last deliberate pull. My body moved forward. When I reached the table, the figure extended a hand. Their palm was bare, but from the center of it stretched the same red cord that bound my arm, running from them to me without slack. I didn't raise my own hand. It rose on its own, fingers opening. The cord between us drew tight. The lanterns brightened, their light pooling over the stone. The flower's scent swelled until it was all I could taste, until breathing felt like swallowing. Somewhere far off, a low rhythmic sound began, a drum, slow and steady. The figure stepped closer, closing the space between us until the red cord was pressed between our hands. Their grip was cool, almost weightless, but the moment they touched me, the heat in the thread vanished. The drum beat slowed, then stopped. The last thing I saw was the knot forming between us, neat, perfect, final. The lantern light went out,